Hello everybody, this is Antonio Wolf, and this is the second part of my Introduction to Dialectics series. Here I would like to focus specifically on dialectics. Being that dialectics are not the method of Hegel, what are they? As mentioned in the last video, they are results, and as results of the immanently critical method, they have some unique characteristics about them. First off, the uniqueness of dialectics isn't just that they come in pairs, it's that they are contradictory pairs. And not just any contradictory pairs, but immanently contradictory ones. That is, internally contradictory. Necessarily contradictory. Most people understand that they're contradictory, but they don't understand how they're contradictory. Now, for anybody who's not Hegelian talking about dialectics, it doesn't matter. Everybody has their own thing. But when you're talking specifically about Hegel, you can't go wrong, because Hegel means something very specific. Hegel's contradiction in dialectics is specifically this immanent, necessary contradiction. If you think about this as a formula, you're wrong. If you think about this as any set of relations in which things interact, you're wrong. Such a conception would, for example, be Bertel Ollmann's conception of dialectics, which seems to reduce it to a contextualization, a principle of everything depends on everything else. If you think about this in any form of contingent contradiction, you're wrong. This would be a conception that considers dialectics any kind of contradiction, such as the contradiction between humans and nature, the contradiction of capitalism and humans, the contradiction of gays and straights, the contradiction of cats and dogs, squirrels and sheep, who knows, doesn't matter. These are not necessary contradictions. Now, to say something about contradiction, since almost nobody understands this except, Hegel scholars, the contradiction which dialectics deals with is often treated by many philosophers as if it is the contradiction which formal logic terms as the law of non-contradiction. A cannot be A and not A at the same time, or A cannot be true and false at the same time, or, in the case of what Paul Redding calls the Aristotelian concept of contradiction in term logic, A cannot instantiate a property or attribute and its opposite at the same time. Hegel does not deny any of these laws, but rather considers contradictions as multiple points of view on the same thing. Being and nothing are indeed separate and different, yet they are each aspects, moments, of understanding the absolute of which they form and are a part of, and thus they are also the same and united. Contradiction exists insofar as there are multiple and opposing positions from which things can be looked at and comprehended, and things can materially be only insofar as there really are different things in unity. When we think of A, yes, we really do think of A. It just so happens that the whole truth of A is also what A is not. It's non-being, its opposite. And this too must be looked at and comprehended as part of A's totality and ultimate truth. In order to think at all, thought must develop through one-sided determinations, which define each side of A momentarily. A and not A indeed cannot be thought at one single moment from one single perspective, but we can see that A and not A are both aspects of A from different perspectives at different moments. So, let me lay out what a dialectic is by terming it the dialectical moment, since, of course, as I've already noted, it is not the entire method. By a dialectic, it is to be understood that this must always mean a relation of inner contradiction, and only inner contradiction. Dialectics are not about contradictions in general, but only these necessary inner contradictions. For clarification's sake, let us say that a dialectic is shorthand for a dialectical relationship. To think dialectically is to think in and through internal contradictions of concepts. This aspect of dialectics regarding thinking must be emphasized. Dialectics are not just a relation between thoughts, but a thought movement. This movement occurs in a thought's conceptual development leading to its other, its opposite, its contradiction. And in its contradiction, the development of that concept then leads right back to the first one which we began. In such a thinking, we see thought stuck in a dialectic. You go from one thought to the other, back again, and over and over and over and over, and there is seemingly no way out from within. This active and moving dialectic is best seen rather than described, and that shall be done in examples later on. For now, I shall continue using the term concept exclusively as the object of dialectics, because even material objects and activities are only intelligible as concepts which we think through to comprehend the world. For insofar as anything is intelligible, it is conceptual, and it is its concept alone which we can elaborate in universal structures. I here offer a static definition of the moment of internal contradiction in Hegel's method that can be termed dialectical. I must emphasize this is only a moment, for as mentioned already, dialectics includes the movement of these contradictory ideas But here I first want to deal with the static appearance of a dialectic prior to exposing its movements. Now, when talking about a dialectic, we're talking about dialectical relationships. So, here's what dialectical relationships are. Such relations are of the kind of contradictory concepts that in their meaning or existence necessarily presuppose and require their opposite. To have one is to have the other. To think through one leads to thinking of the other. To change one is to change the other. This is the famous unity of opposites dialectics is described as by many Marxists. Such materialist relations are worker and capitalist, use value and exchange value, material and ideal, etc. What makes these dialectics? Well, the worker and the boss have no meaning or existence without each other, necessarily develop into each other in the thinking of their concept, and if you have one, you know you have the other. The distinction of use value and exchange value requires that each presuppose the other in order to mean anything. For what would it mean to consider products of labor to be use values in an ahistorical categorical sense, without the opposition to another value imminently contradictory to it? In material relations of this kind, this means that a change in one is a change in its other. For example, a change of one term may change an entire dynamic of relations by supplanting it with new terms, or that a change in relations may supplant terms with new ones. Form and content are inseparable. This relation of inner contradiction, in a strict sense, is all that a dialectic can be as merely a moment of Hegel's method. Hegel's method is more than just the dialectics that arise, though they are important as moments to it. Whenever we are engaging in dialectics, we know that we are dealing with the study of a plurality or series of dialectical relationships. The logical movement from one dialectic to another occurs, to our conscious perspective, by an inner analysis of these contradictory relationships, the inner development of one from the other and back again, and this very movement between concepts as a concept itself is what pushes thought onward insofar as the analysis generates more concepts to continue. This movement of concepts, however, is not our subjective movement in thought, such as one imagines in a mere arbitrary given definition, but is the movement of the concept itself, something that will become apparent in the examples. Why does thought move from dialectic to dialectic, contradiction to contradiction? The reason is simple. Because insofar as we are thinking them, we cannot stop thinking until they are fully rationalized. Reason cannot and does not stop at contradictions. If there is a way to solve it, reason will find it. If there isn't, it sure as hell will try. In the sphere of thought, the clash of contradiction forces thought to move of its own accord by the power of reason, the drive of thought to find ultimate reasons to ground itself. And insofar as the concept points itself to reasons within and beyond it, it moves on. In the sphere of materiality, contradiction manifests as clashing forces which in their relation and content inherently destabilized by their very concept and nature. Dialectics may end in a constructive sublation or dissolution. The first, the path of the dialectics of the science of logic. The latter, the path of the dialectics of the phenomenology of spirit. So that is that for dialectics. Alright, lots of words, not much clarity, perhaps. Maybe an example will suffice. And this is the simplest one that anyone could ever show. And here it is. The example is the first dialectic of the science of logic. First, we begin with an indeterminate thought. The first thing we could say about that thought is, give it a name. Being. The thought is. A thought of what? Well, we don't know. It's indeterminate. But what is it that we call an empty content? For here we cannot speak of ideas nor thoughts, for we don't have the conceptual tools to do so. Being, insofar as empty of content, is pure being. It is not any kind of being. It is not a being. It is pure being. All being. Indeterminate being. A being without definition. What is this emptiness? This emptiness is nothing. Being is nothing. Pretty simple, right? Well, except, it gets a bit complex. Then we turn to nothing. We think about nothing. Well, there's nothing to think about nothing because it's nothing. It's indeterminate. It has no content either. But wait, there's more. This nothing is, and in being, it is being. The strange dialectic of being and nothing is one of content and form. Nothing tries to act as a content, being tries to act as a form, both separate from each other, yet inseparable. Being is nothing, first, because they share the same content. They are both indeterminate. Their definition is the same. But they are also each other in the fact that they also share the same form. Content-wise, they're both nothing. Form-wise, they're both being. Now, there's a bit of conceptual trickery going on here, but I'll leave that for another video. Returning to a point made in the first video about immanent critique and coherent absolutes, Hegel mentions the concepts of the science of logic as definitions of the absolute. Each of these definitions, however, fails. For example, back to being. As far as definition in absolute sense, being fails to be an absolute definition. Why? Because its definition, its content, depends on the concept of nothing. Nothing likewise fails to be absolute. Its content depends on being. Is this really a problem, however, when being and nothing are one and the same? Can we not then simply collapse the distinction into one and simply say there is being, or there is nothing, and leave it at that? Hegel says no. After all, the reason we made the distinction in the first place was because we wanted to say something about being and nothing. But when we abstract into pure universality, we find that we get rid of all particularity. We abstract from all individuality, but when this ultimate universality itself depends on definitions of difference, that is, we only think of being and nothing in distinction to each other, then we are left with a contradiction. As a matter of fact, multiple contradictions arising from this one single contradiction. In attempting to define the absolute as a perfect universal without particularity, we find we can't define it. We find it is a bunch of nothing, an emptiness, an absence of meaning. It has no intelligibility. Thus, that which is supposed to be the most intelligible, which grounds all other intelligibility, is itself unintelligible. We find that because pure being is everything and therefore is no specific thing, it is, to put it in a Heideggerian spin, no thing. Conceptually speaking, we don't know what is actually different about pure being and nothing. As far as conceptual content goes, they are indeed one and the same. So this is the dialectic. By being and nothing, we mean different things. That's at least what we intend. But when we are asked to define or to put forth an intelligible reason for this difference, we don't know. In fact, when we try to give reasons, we find that we have exactly this dialectic. We find that being is nothing and nothing is being, and we don't know what the difference actually is. Despite having no intention to do so, we end up breaking the law of non-contradiction through the use of purely necessary reasoning. All we did was pure conceptual analysis, a thinking through of the concept. So note that pure necessary analysis has led us to breaking the supposed rules of logic. How illogical! And if you wanted to, you could just keep thinking over and over and over again. You could think being and nothing as many ways as you like, and insofar as you keep to the method of pure and simple conceptual analysis, you're not going to get anywhere else. You're just going to think back and forth between being and nothing infinitely. There is nowhere else to go on that level. On the level of dialectic, you are stuck. But note, the dialectic seems absolute. You don't have to get out. Being is nothing, nothing is being. Doesn't mean much. As a matter of fact, doesn't mean anything at all. But as far as definition, as far as content and form goes, that's it. There is nothing else at this level of analysis. The analytic form of reasoning, which this conceptual analysis takes part in, is what Hegel calls the understanding. Here Hegel is piggybacking off the work of Immanuel Kant in the Transcendental Dialectic, where pure reason does just this. It leads to pure, irreconcilable contradiction. At this level of the dialectic, everything seems to have been suspended. The law of non-contradiction no longer holds. Completely opposite things are both true and false at the same time. Everything has melded into one. We don't know the differences. We don't know what the unity really is. The very things, the objects which we wanted to understand, have disappeared before us, imploded or exploded by the power of analytic pure reason, the reason of the understanding, the reasoning which tears things apart into abstract different definitions which are absolutely separate and disconnected. To this form of reasoning, being and nothing would seem to have nothing to do in relation with each other. Being is being, nothing is nothing. Yet, when we engage this type of reasoning, we end up contradicting ourselves. What seemed to be separate and different has all of a sudden melted into a mess of contradictions. Dialectics are these self-subversions of reason, in which, in trying to say one thing, in trying to think one thing, we inevitably end up saying or thinking the exact opposite, despite having no intention whatsoever to do so. In speaking of being, we thought we were speaking of being. Instead, we end up speaking about nothing. In speaking of nothing, likewise, we thought we were only speaking of nothing. Yet we end up speaking of being. Hegel's methodological secret lies within and between what is not spoken of in this dialectic. It is in what is implicit, what is not yet explicit before us, either written or spoken. This movement of thought, which is not spoken but done, it is an activity. Itself becomes the object of thought. That is to say, thinking becomes thought. No longer is it being or nothing, but rather what is happening in and through being and nothing. Or rather, more properly, what happens in thinking, being, and nothing. So what happens? What happens is being vanishes, nothing vanishes. That is to say, the immediate supplanting of being by nothing in thinking it, and of the supplanting of nothing by being in thinking it, this immediate supplanting is what Hegel terms vanishing. And that is the movement of becoming. I will expand the being, nothing, becoming to determine being dialectic in another video specifically for itself, hopefully with video and actual video. I have diagrams and things I've done to make this more intelligible. Here I just wanted to hit upon the dialectical moment within that specific dialectic. A dialectic which, by the way, as I said, some funky things go on. But unless you read the science of logic, specifically up to the end of right at the beginning of becoming, you won't realize, because Hegel doesn't tell you, that there was funky stuff going on. Until next time, I'll be making a couple other videos trying to expand on the things which I alluded to in my first video and other things I've alluded to in this video. I'd like to thank people on Reddit who provided questions and grilled me very, very forcefully to expand on and clarify my claims. I'd also like to thank a couple of individuals on Facebook who made some very great responses that gave me quite a bit to think. Until next time, this is Antonio Wolf. Thank you for watching.